like go low enough. So I'm like, you could tell I'm new to all this stuff because I'm like the old lady, like, how do you make this thing work?
Hey, it's Dr. Karen Tang. I'm a board-certified gynecologist and minimally invasive surgeon, and you may have seen a viral video I made about biological sex and gender. What I wanted to do was move beyond some of this terminology and definitions and into more of a discussion of the lived experience of people who are transgender or gender non-binary, and kind of talk about this on a human level. Recently, I did an Instagram Live with Schuyler Bailar, who is a trans athlete and speaker and educator, and we had such an amazing discussion. I felt like I needed to give him a platform to speak more at length about his experiences. And so we had so much amazing material that I decided to split it up into even separate YouTube videos because there's too much to kind of cover in one. And so I hope you enjoy the discussion. I learned a ton and hope you will too.
Very honored to have Schuyler Bailar. He's the first trans athlete who competed on a Division I men's athletic team. You know, what came out of the TikTok was a lot of discussion on biological sex and definitions. But what I felt was obviously missing was this huge piece of, what is the lived experience of someone who's transgender or gender non-binary. My first thing, I just wanted to give you a chance to introduce yourself, talk about, your own biography and your work.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me here. I also really enjoyed our live, and I was just so, like I told you on the live, so thrilled to see you out here sharing real science and actual facts about biological sex and about sort of things that were pertaining to my lived experience as a trans person. So yeah, just love that you're here. I'm Schuyler. I use he, him pronouns. I'm 24 years old. I am the first trans athlete to compete for a Division I men's team, and I swam for 4 years at Harvard University from 2015 to 2019. And I'm the only trans athlete to have done so for all 4 years on a men's team. So that allowed me to step into an advocacy role, advocacy space. And I've done that for about 6 or 7 years now, sharing my experience as a trans athlete. And that has sort of morphed into lots of other things. So now I'm also a life coach, a DEI consultant, an educator, speaker. I am an author now. I've actually written a book, a fiction novel that will be coming out this fall, which I'm really excited about.
Oh, it's so exciting.
Yeah, I'm really excited about it. It's a middle grade fiction novel about a trans kid who's also Korean American, also a swimmer.
So first I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about your own background. And some of the questions I've gotten from people are things like, how young can someone be as a child before they understand their gender identity, or, that understand that they may be transgender or gender non-binary?
Yeah. So I always like to start with a little bit of science that I've read about with this, and I can talk about my own experience. But according to the Mayo Clinic, gender identity solidifies around the ages of 3 to 5. So people usually have some semblance of their identity, gender specifically, around the age of 3 to 5. That's usually when you start school, when you start noticing that there are other boys or other girls, or noticing gender at all. That's exactly when gender identity starts to solidify for oneself. As soon as I was allowed to choose who I was hanging out with boys. I aligned myself with the other boys as a kid, but I didn't have the words or the education to know anything about myself. So I didn't actually declare that I was transgender and that I'm actually a man, a boy, until I was, I think, 18 and a half. So it took me a long time, but I spent my entire childhood presenting as male. I had short hair. I wore boys' clothes. I played with the boys. Most people thought I was a boy, but I didn't have, again, the language or the courage or the support to say, this is who I am. So what I did was I religiously defined myself as a tomboy. I'd introduce myself like, hi, I'm Schuyler, I'm a tomboy. And I'd literally tell you that if you met me, because I needed people to know I wasn't a girl the way that other people were girls. And I think had somebody given me the language of transgender, or I had met another trans person, I'd be like, oh my God, yes, that's it. I always say that I've always felt the same way about myself that I do now in terms of my gender. Like that experience of my gender is not new. It's just the words that I have been able to use, right, to describe it and say, oh, this is it. That's that feeling, and say, this is who I am. So coming out 18 and a half, knowing who I am, probably since 5 or 6.
That is so key, because I think, like you said, when you're a small child, you just don't have that language.
I think that, people being able to see that other people exist like them is huge, no matter like what space we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
And you kind of, especially marginalized identities, where the media is whitewashed and completely filled with cis people and straight people, and you don't get to see yourself. So when you do, I think it can be really, really moving. But I also want to add in that there are trans people who didn't know, and they didn't have a feeling that shifted. They don't discover that their identity is different from what they were assigned until much later, and that's also okay. There's nothing invalid about somebody, and sometimes I think it's odd. It's used as a backwards argument where people are like, well, you didn't act like a boy when you were a kid, so you can't be trans. And I just don't want that to also be part of that narrative. For me, it was very sort of I think what's called like stereotypical, in that I presented very masculine, very boyish as a kid, and then came out as trans. And so people see, they're like, oh, it makes sense. But there are many people who don't do that for lots of different reasons, either because they didn't know, or because they're comfortable presenting as a more feminine way, or because it's just how they identify, but they still identify as a man. And then that's, again, the shift between gender expression and gender identity.
Yeah.
Right? But I think it's just important that we don't police anybody's coming out process.
I did want to talk to you a little bit, because one of the things that came up in our conversation was sort of this intersection of race and culture and gender, and especially in the Asian community. And so I wanted to kind of ask you about your experience, kind of what is your family background, and how did your family and friends and community come to terms with or support you in this process?
So I'm half Korean. My mother's family moved to the US in the late 1960s. I would say that coming out to my Korean family was the most nerve-wracking part of my entire coming out process. I was so nervous to tell them. And my grandmother is very Catholic, and so is my entire Korean family. And so if you add sort of like immigrant Catholic, like Korean Catholic, I was just like, oh no, and I had actually come out as a lesbian, as gay, before I came out as trans, but that was sort of like a stepping stone for me trying to figure out my identity. And I just not told her. I just neglected to tell her. And I said, I'm not going to tell her. And maybe one day I'll marry a woman and then we'll tell her. But I just didn't. When I came out as trans, I was like, okay, this is going to be a different problem. Like, I can't just like not tell her. Honestly, I was like worried about language barriers. I was worried about understanding. So
yeah.
But I finished, and she just looked at me and she was like, okay, I already knew that. The one caveat she had for me, she was like, in Korean culture, daughters take care of their parents.
Oh,
My mother has no more daughters. I have a brother, so two boys. And she's like, your mother has no more daughters, so you, Schuyler, as oldest, you still take care of your parents.
Wow.
It's like, I got you.
Yeah.
I can do that. So I had a really lovely experience with my
That's
grandmother.
wonderful. Yeah.
She's been honestly oddly supportive. Like, I will say that I think that the fact that I went to Harvard and that I did these sort of like stereotypically successful
things, yeah,
had a huge impact on not necessarily her specifically, but just my Korean family in general, because they care more about the fact that like I'm a Harvard athlete who's like successful, quote unquote, than they do about my gender. Does that make any sense? There's a privilege that I have there that I don't want to ignore, but that has allowed me to step into that space. And my grandma's been incredibly supportive. She comes to my speeches. She watches.
Oh, great. Yeah.
I actually sent her the talk that you and I did because I knew she.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
Be another Asian American. But yeah, so she's been great. But that's a rarity,
Yeah.
And I always like to recognize that and also point out that I'm fighting for the day when it's not a rarity, when it's not a privilege.
Part of what you said about like, that she knows you, like she loves you and supports you. We had talked about in our live that I think, for a lot of Asians, like there's a difference between, and this is for everybody, a difference between someone that they individually know and love and care for in their family, versus like a concept, like the concept of transgender people, may be easy to make a judgment about.
There's a lot there, but I think first and foremost, she loves me and I know that, and she's very proud of me and all the things that I do. So I think that helps though, that I'm not just trans, like I'm a whole person. And I think that actually is the whole key of all of this, which is that the more allies can see us, or other people can see us as whole people, as not just trans, like I'm still all these other things. I think we can kind of understand people more.
What you brought up in terms of, religion, the fact that she's Catholic and, there's an additional kind of like layer of like kind of a religious perspective. So interesting, because I'm Christian, my husband's Catholic, and actually, he teaches like Catholic ethics. So we have a lot of interesting discussions about, reproductive health and ethics and things like that. And something that I've really, felt very terrible about is the fact that, in a lot of at least like American culture, people have felt that if you belong to a certain religious group, particularly kind of Christian groups or Catholic groups, that means that you don't accept, LGBTQ, like, transgender, like, people are gay, that just somehow, your identity as being Christian means that you reject these concepts. And so, which is obviously not true across the board. There are quite a few, people who are LGBTQIA and are Christian and Catholic. I'm hoping that, this is something that people in religious communities can continue to explore and, come to terms with and understand and to, be open to learning about and, to growing. And so.
I agree. I mean, I think there's a lot of stigmatization of religion in general, and I feel like I hold multiple parts about that. There's a piece of me that totally understands there's so many religious folks, Christian, Catholic included, who are very accepting and affirming of LGBTQ folks, and that's
Hmm.
great. Then there's also many that are not, and
Hmm.
unfortunately, the folks that are not often create sort of a bad name. You know what I mean
Yeah.
for those that are, and the reason isn't necessarily because it's like, oh, one person, diluting this whole group of good.
Hmm.
It's there's so much harm that is done by the groups that are
Yeah.
intolerant and
Yeah.
unkind. So I have a couple of friends who are Mormons, and I made a post about how we found common ground, and I thought that was
Hmm.
really beautiful and
Yeah.
important. And I got dragged on the internet. People were really upset about
Wow.
this. They were like, "How dare you bring this into this space? This makes me feel unsafe here. I have so much religious trauma. Like I don't trust
Oh, yeah.
anybody." And so I think there's validity to both sides.
Yeah. Yeah.
Unfortunately, I think the folks that have been really hurt have no interest in trying to build that bridge because of the institution of religion in many ways
Yeah.
really harmful to a lot of queer and trans folks. And I have a lot of nuance there for myself because my grandmother's very Catholic and very affirming. And
Hmm.
my grandfather on my dad's side was a minister.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And so I have a lot of really Christian influence
Yeah.
in my life. And I don't personally identify as religious. I think I'm probably more spiritual than anything, but
Hmm.
I have a strong appreciation for the culture and the what's the right word, the kinship, I think, and
Yeah.
faith that
Yeah. Like the community of, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
community, that's a
Yeah.
better word.
Yeah.
But I also just see the harm and the exclusion that it also has historically, and
Yeah.
I struggle with that. And I think a lot of LGBTQ folks who are not religious also struggle with that. And the
Hmm.
folks who are religious and also queer with institutions that disagree with them. So, for
Yeah.
example, the queer and Mormons that I know really struggle with that intersection
Yeah.
of their identity, and it's really tough.
I kind of come back to what we've talked about, like the concepts and institutions and things like that versus like individual people. And so hopefully kind of key to reconciliation, I'm sure, will come at the level of individual people.
I think it's all about diving into common humanity and from
Yeah,
all
absolutely. Hmm.
sides. You know what I mean? Like somebody who's super uber, like right Christian, Catholic, something, and maybe not accepting of trans people still has some kind of common humanity with me, and vice versa. And if we
Yeah.
can find that, maybe there's a way to move forward.
So thank you all for joining us for the discussion. I hope you enjoyed it. I know I did. And I learned a ton and really kind of like, got me to think more deeply about these issues. I'm going to link the rest of the series so that you guys can see my other talks with Schuyler and also some links to some other resources in the description of this video. So thanks so much. Like and subscribe. Join me for other topics in the future. Have a great day. Bye.